Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Voice of Adoptees, which brings together diverse and unique voices from around the world to share their stories. If you like today's episode, remember to give us a like, subscribe, and leave a review. Here's your host, David Shunk.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of here at Voice of Adoptees. Today, we're joined by an amazing woman out in Seattle, Washington, Dr. Becca Wellington. Her story is going to include some very interesting tidbits. We're going to hear about her journey, and we definitely are going to be talking about her upcoming book that she's very excited to share, and we're going to get to know her. So, Dr. Wellington, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here, and please just call me Becca. All my students call me Becca.
Okay, Becca,
yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
Well, welcome, and we're glad that you're here. So let's start from the beginning, and why don't you share a little about yourself with everyone?
I live in Seattle, Washington, and I live with my husband and my two daughters and our dog and our cat. And I'm a lifelong teacher. My field is education. So I've taught in outdoor education after college, and then got my master's in teaching at Seattle University and taught high school for a number of years, which I loved. And then while I was actually pregnant with my first daughter, who's now 13, I started working on my doctorate at the University of Washington in education history. I'm a diehard historian, fan of history, which is kind of connects with my thoughts about adoption and why I wrote this book. But I spent 7 years working on my doctorate at the University of Washington, had my second daughter along the way, and I've taught at the University of Washington in the College of Education, and I am now currently teaching at Seattle University in their College of Education, which is also a program I'm an alum of. And I'm also teaching down in Tacoma at the University of Puget Sound in the School of Education. So I work a lot with pre-service teachers and undergraduates who are just interested in education, and I love it. I'm very passionate about education and passionate about teaching.
Yeah, wow, I can tell. I was going to say, it sounds like you're educating the entire West Coast of the United States.
I know. I've kind of come to the point where I need to settle in at one university. It's I love both Seattle University and University of Puget Sound, but it's kind of frying my brain doing the two school gig. So
Yeah. Have you ever thought about developing your own curriculum to sell maybe at one point? Developing your own online curriculum to sell to
Uh,
universities? I mean, hey, that sounds like a good marketing.
I know that's definitely a thing. I do a lot of curriculum development and work with a lot of K-12 teachers doing, that's sort of what I teach, is curriculum development and education history. But yeah, I'm kind of hesitant to get into the marketing side of it. I love teaching, and so I like to really talk about and discuss teaching and community building. And so I think for me, it's my passion is being in the classroom, being
It
with
makes
people.
sense. Yeah, that
So,
makes sense. You can let someone else worry about that.
yeah, that sounds good.
Great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So let's talk about your adoption. So, you were adopted fairly young.
hmm
Um,
I was 2 days old, so I
two.
was really young.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So you were adopted 2 days old. That's very young. Obviously, I can't ask you if you have any memories
Yeah,
because that's pretty early.
yeah,
Um, what about I know that your past with adoption, you don't focus as much on it back then compared to now with what you're working on in your book.
yeah,
But what can you like
yeah,
share or brush upon some little bit of
yeah.
history there, kind of what, if you know about the circumstances of what happened, or if you want to talk about that, and if not, that's perfectly
Yeah.
fine. And just so we kind of know a little bit about the backstory of, the whole question a lot of people have is, what's the adopted child's story?
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think, knowing that backstory is so important, especially, from the historical perspective. We all have histories, right? Um, so this has been a really interesting last couple of years for me because I'm new onto the scene of adoption, which is funny to say. I'm adopted, but I spent the first 40 years of my life really not identifying as somebody who's adopted. I've always known I was adopted, and I just grew up thinking, "Oh, it's not a big deal. It's not part of my identity. That's for other people." Right? And to be really honest and vulnerable, I would think, "Oh, people who are having a hard time with adoption, they make it a big deal. I'm fine." And then two things happened to me. I gave birth to my first child in 2010. Giving birth to my first daughter, that was the first time in my life I met somebody I'm biologically related to. And it blew my mind and triggered a lot of things for me. And, you asked, do you remember, being adopted? And I was adopted at 2 days old. I will honestly say that giving birth and connecting with my own biological child through that birth process triggered really, really deep memories that were of my birth. And what became crystal clear to me through the birth of my first child and my second daughter was that adoption is traumatic. And I understood for the first time that my birth mother had a traumatic experience in giving birth to me and giving me away. There's no possibility that it wasn't traumatic for her and for both of us. And then several years later, after my second daughter was born, my sister, who was 2 years older than me, also adopted at about 2 days old. She died of a drug overdose. And that also just, capsized the metaphorical boat of my life. And really set me on a path of discovery. And I was doing a lot of trauma therapy or, grief counseling, and a lot of things came up. And I realized I have really got to look into, my history and understand things. And I started to do some inquiry and realized I was born in 1975 in the state of California and adopted through a private adoption transaction. My birth certificate that I have and have a connection with has been falsified. It has my adopting parents on there as my parents. So I consider that a falsified document, and I cannot access my original birth certificate. And California is one of the states that has the most conservative closed adoption laws in the country. And I would literally have to go and get a petition from a judge in a scenario of life and death to get access to my original birth records. And so I just hit this wall and I thought, what am I going to do? How do I get some answers? Not necessarily like I need to connect with my birth family, but I just wanted to know my past and know my ancestry and know who my people are. And I do a lot of research and collaborate with really amazing Indigenous scholars, and through working with them, I've learned a lot about the importance of ancestry and your roots and your homeland. And I don't know what mine is. And so as a historian, I thought, okay, well, I can't find it this way. I'm going to just start diving into the history and the policy of adoption practices to understand how we got to this point, because that's kind of how, as a historian, how my mind works. Like I have to know the backstory. And so that put me on the path of writing my book, which is called Who is a Worthy Mother? An Intimate History of Adoption. And it's coming out spring 2024 through the University of Oklahoma Press. And it's a really interesting sort of hybrid. It's not a hardcore academic text. I really wrote it. It's a lot of memoir, a lot of personal story, but dovetailed into kind of the evolution of adoption practices and policies in the United States over the last 100 years. So
Wow. Yeah,
that's it.
that's a mouthful. All right.
Yeah,
Okay. I had one question. I was really hoping that I wouldn't forget it, and I didn't. So that's good.
good.
So my burning question was, well, more like of a kind of an observation. When you were talking about how, 40 years you didn't really connect with being adopted in the full meaning until you had your firstborn child, and
Yeah,
you mentioned that's the first time you got to see a biological connection,
yes,
and that statement made me think about how many people that I know who are adopted, when they have a child, the same feeling. It changes
yeah.
everything because for the
It
first
changes.
time they
Yeah,
have their own blood looking at them, and they can finally see, like, wow, my child has my smile, my child has
yeah,
my eyes. And for small things like that, a lot of people, the people who aren't adopted, they kind of take that, you know, they get that opportunity every day of their life. They don't take it for granted. That's what I'm trying to say. They take it for
yeah,
granted that they get to look in the eyes of their parents every day and say, "Oh yeah, my dad looks like this, my mom looks like this." Makes sense. And adopted children, especially when we don't have access to records, or if they were falsified, like you said your birth certificate was. I was adopted from Russia, and international adoption is a whole different thing. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
they were falsifying papers over there. Most of the time, the person they listed as your father wasn't even your father. It was just
yeah,
I mean, so the first time you see a biological photo, or you get to see that, it changes everything. I mean,
yeah.
I remember it like yesterday, 10 years ago, when I saw a photo of my biological mother for the first time.
Wow.
I immediately saw her smile, and
Mm,
I was just in shock. I'm like, that's unbelievable. But
yeah,
anyway, so that's a really cool kind of connection you made, because a lot of people feel that same connection.
yeah,
So I'm curious, what was when you had your first child and you saw that biological connection, you said that now you kind of understand the importance of going back. Was it at that moment, when as soon as you had and you gave birth to your first child, or did you kind of have to think about it for a little bit and say, maybe I should go back and look into who am I? That's what I
yeah,
like to ask on the podcast, is who am I? You know,
yeah,
journey
yeah,
of self-discovery and everything. But
yeah.
yeah.
You know, what was really clear to me, the first couple months when when my first daughter was born, it just triggered a lot of thoughts about my birth mother that I hadn't ever understood before, because you know, I hadn't been a mother. I hadn't given birth to a baby, and she did, right? And I wouldn't say that at that time I was like, "Oh, I've got to find my people." It was kind of that was the first piece of it, but it wasn't conscious. I think, and I write about this in the book. I from a research perspective, uh, my doctoral dissertation is on student resistance to assimilating education in off-reservation boarding schools in the progressive era. And I won't go into the history of it too much, but the US government had a practice of, you know, taking children and the brutal practice of assimilating indigenous children into, a white colonial, you know, identity through education. And so through my research, I've really gotten to sort of understand the power of assimilation projects. And I've also, in working with Native historians, really come to understand the importance of genealogy and and ancestry and like the blood, right? You were talking about sort of the bloodline, and knowing the people who came before you, and that we are connected to them, and that their stories are part of our stories. And so, I had my first child, and then I was sort of in this research world of learning about assimilation, and working with amazing Indigenous scholars who speak a lot about the importance of the past and ancestral connection. And sort of it all kind of started to culminate in my mind, and I realized I need to know, my past, and I need to know it. Like, there's a through line, right? Our past, our present, our future. My future are my babies, right? Who I'm biologically, they're my blood, and
Right.
they want to know their
Right.
past, and I also think there's a lot of truth to sort of where your ancestors walked. What did they do? Where were they walking on the planet, and how were they interacting with each other and the world around them? That shapes who we are today. And I just didn't have those answers. I still don't have those answers. But one way to fill the hole for me is to understand why I don't have the answers. And so
Right.
I had to look at the policy history, and the practices, um, to understand that. Yeah, and I talked a little bit about assimilation, and one of the threads I pull on in the book is that a lot of what has shaped adoption practices internationally, and on US soil, is an assimilation agenda. Like, we can take this baby from over here and put them in this family, and like literally cut the cord, and they will become part of this culture. And I think that's just profoundly damaging, because you can't cut the cord, right?
Right. I mean, and they're all going to grow up and they're all going to find out eventually where they're from one day, and that's going to spike a lot of curiosity.
Yes.
I mean, talk about, yeah, and people wonder why there's a higher rate of identity issues with adopted individuals. There's a lot of, I could tell you how many times I've been contacted over the years by college students or professors who are doing this research on adopted children from this country or medical conditions for adopted children. And it's like, it makes you kind of question it, and you're thinking, why do they want to find out all this information about me? Because the last thing you want is to be adopted and think you're so different and you're so, because people that have traumatic backgrounds, they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
They want to fit in. They want to be seen by everyone as the same. So, I can understand how it can bring up emotions. Um, feelings that you didn't know you had that have been there for a while deep down inside, and
Yeah.
you have those triggers that set off certain things. And but I wanted to say something about, you mentioned you're working with a lot of experts to find out history or like the roots of your background. Have you ever done any of the DNA testing, the 23andMe, the
Yeah.
ancestry?
So that's a really great question, and a lot of people have said, "Oh, why don't you just do that?" And so there's a couple of things that I actually, so I tried to find out, and talk to family, and tried to see, is there a way I can get access, like a paper trail, to who my biological family is, and there was nothing, which was just kind of astounded me. I'm like, how does a baby, a newborn, get transferred from here to there, and there isn't a paper trail? Like, and so part of me was just like furious. I mean, that's like, it's the really, like, the commodification of a baby. It's insane. But I I actually started, I ordered a 23andMe kit, and I thought, because I know that's really opened a lot of doors for people. And then I kind of, the other thing that happened for me in all this, like having babies, and around the time when my sister passed away, I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And I'm fine. I'm good. I'm have an amazing doctor here in Seattle. I'm very fortunate and privileged to have great access to excellent healthcare, which is a privilege. Um, but it's a genetic thing, and so there, I started to have concerns about doing 23andMe because you're selling your DNA essentially, and I actually talked with an adoption attorney here in Seattle, and she advised me to not do it. And my husband, who works in cybersecurity, and he was a little hesitant just because I don't know what the future is with, you know, identity security and me selling my DNA and having a autoimmune disease in terms of, getting access to insurance in the future. And so my husband was concerned, and then this attorney said, you're putting your identity at risk, you know. So she advised, because once you do it and you send your DNA off your saliva swab, like that's it, your DNA is on the market. And so I decided, yeah, I'm going to hold off on that. And then I went down this rabbit hole of writing the book, and that really helped. That kind of satiated some answers for me. And I also think something might happen through the book. I don't know,
Yeah, well, I'm sure it will. I mean, it sounds intriguing. We're gonna get into that in a minute, and you can go as far in depth as you can tell us. Hopefully, we can get maybe a little sneak peek of something. That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Um, so you're figuring all this out. Have you ever been open about your adoption with your members of your family today? Like, do your kids ever ask questions about it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that's really pushing me now. So my daughters are 11 and 13, and they know I'm writing the book, and are they are like, we want to know our ancestry. So they're, that's been sort of a catalyst for me too, is it's not just me that loses connection, it's, the next generation, right? That line is cut, and then it impacts future generations.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to look at it. It's almost like, maybe you aren't 100% comfortable yourself getting to know more information, but as soon as you have kids, it's almost your responsibility to provide them
Yeah,
with information, and the whole thing changes. Now all of a sudden you feel obligated because they're going to want to know, and
yeah,
the cycle continues because it's the same for anyone who's adopted. I mean, the way I saw it, my of course, international adoption is way different, but
yeah,
in some ways, but we still all came from different people to begin with, and we all figure out our own identity as we get older. But I have a lot of debates with a lot of people adopted from Russia. We have big communities. There's over 60,000 in the United States alone, more than that.
yeah,
There's a ton of Russian adoptees around the world,
yes,
but a large percentage of them, say almost half of them, aren't that very interested in a lot of details about Russia. There's a lot of anger about it.
yeah,
And of course, the political situation doesn't help anything either.
yeah,
But and you find out as soon as they have children, they suddenly think, well, by law, they're dual citizens. They can claim it through their parents. So, for example, when I have kids, they can be Russian citizens and American citizens.
wow,
So, and you don't want to be that parent that doesn't like give them the option when they get older to have another
yeah,
citizenship if they want, because they're going to not be too happy about it. But
yeah,
um, there's a lot of other, implications. But to get to my point, I think it's the responsibility of, because your role changes from yourself to now you're a parent, but
yes,
you as a parent, you should feel obligated to provide as much information to the child and make them come up with their own decisions as they get older, because they might be more interested than you, and that's okay. They may not share all the views you do, but I just think, you're being, smart about it. I'm complimenting you for seeing it from that perspective, and I think that's very important.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that came up for me, and I know this is a catalyst for a lot of people too. I mean, there are a lot of amazing people who have been fighting to open records and, to unseal records, largely from the health perspective, and that kind of came to the forefront for me when I got my Crohn's diagnosis, which is that's a genetic disease. Like I inherited that from one of my ancestors, from somebody, and I very likely could pass it down to my daughters, and knowing that our biological history and our predispositions for different forms of cancer or, autoimmune diseases or, that's a matter of life and death for a lot of people to know that. Like I have a number of friends who have like a long lineage of breast cancer and they have made really proactive strategic decisions knowing that they have like a 60% chance of getting breast cancer. And so knowing that history is so important. And I've spent my whole life filling out doctor's forms saying I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, and now I'm like, oh, I know I have Crohn's, you know um and if I had known that I had a predisposition for that, the years leading up to the diagnosis would have been a lot easier for me. I had a really hard time until I finally figured out, oh, this is what's going on for me, you know.
Right. And so do you think there's not enough sympathy in the courts in Seattle or California in that area with the fact that now you have this new diagnosis? Have you tried to persuade a judge to release it on the grounds of medical reasons?
I have not. I have not. I think I could probably make a decent case for that. And I might get there. There's a part of me, it's taken a lot for me to write the book. I mean, it's an emotional journey, and considering that like a decade ago I didn't even identify as an adoptee. Like for me, I've been really off of social media for a while. Just politically, it was just a
Probably a
such
good thing, I was going to say, yeah.
a nightmare. But when I got my book went into peer review and the editors were like, this thing is gonna get published, you've got to get on social media. So I'm kind of new to social media and I'm really trying to get the word out. But I, for the first time, like 2 months ago, identified myself on social media as an adoptee, which that was huge for me. Like
Yeah.
I just realized I don't identify as an adoptee. So, I'm kind of taking some baby steps. The book is this huge step. And then I just am going to see where it takes me. And maybe after it's come out, I'll be ready to take that next step and really pursue, a case in California. I mean, it's just been astounding for me doing the research and just realizing I was born in probably the worst state in terms of birth record access. Literally, it's California is the worst, and they are still just locked down so tight. Anybody born, I think, before like 1994, like you can't get them. And I think the reason behind that, and this is kind of one of the claims in my book, is just there's a 100+ year history of distrust of birth mothers, and predominantly the women who are losing their babies through forced relinquishment and a lot of just really abusive practices are mothers of color, indigenous women, poor women, working class, really vulnerable women. And on the flip side, you have a lot of adopting families who have a lot of privilege, and they if you look at who's been advocating behind these policies, there are a lot of politicians who have adopted children, and they just don't want to break that seal, you know. So it's a privileging of the adopting community against the birth mother community, and that is still largely shaping policy, unfortunately.
Right. And I feel there's going to be a divide in that for a long time because I don't think there's an easy solution.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, there should be. I mean, you can call it just being a good human being, but we all know that's a little complicated these days. There's just
Yeah.
too much going back and forth. But I'm sure, people who write books about it are open about it, like you're discovering all this. You're going to be providing another resource, another tool out there to have the world look at adoption differently. And I think that is what we're all really trying to do.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think this podcast is part of it. I think it's just great. More and more people are just having conversations about it, and in a way problematizing or sort of disrupting sort of old narratives about adoption, and sort of these stagnant perspectives like, oh, all adoption is good and babies should just be handed out, and they'll be better with that family. Um, it's like, well, what's behind all that?
Yeah, no, when I went back to Russia the first time with my mom to see my whole biological side of the family, my adopted mother had to sit there and explain to them that Americans don't adopt Russian kids to be put in labor camps, and no, we don't adopt Russian babies to use their limbs. I mean, the Russian people are amazing people. I love them. They're the most hospitable people in the world. It's the government that I'm just not a fan of, to be honest. But um, they've been told for the last 50 plus years that Americans only adopt children in Russia for terrible reasons. So that's why when I got discovered over there, the family was amazed that he's actually healthy. He's not missing an arm or a leg. I mean, and
Wow.
they thought that their kids would be experimented on, and the older generations, it's that old sense of distrust. It's back to the Soviet era of don't
Mhm.
trust the Americans, and the Americans are don't trust the Russians, but
We're
we're
kind of back into that, aren't
yeah,
we?
exactly. And we're living
Yeah.
proof that, and we're trying to now change that narrative, like you said. Um,
Yeah.
so I just wanted to share that little tidbit.
Wow.
But let's move on to your book. I want to hear all about it. What inspired you, besides being adopted? What inspired you behind it? What's the idea, and what's the number one message you want to get out there to the public?
Wow, that's a great question. I think what inspired me, or really was the catalyst, sort of, and I had to do it, was after my sister died. I wrote it for her. She was adopted. I was also adopted, and she gave a child up for adoption, and she had a really hard life, um, and really had a lot of trauma. And I think adoption was a huge part of that. And in many ways, she was just not seen or heard, and sort of silenced in birth and silenced in death. And so I wrote the book for her, and I write a lot about her in it. And you're right, as an adopted baby, and then as a birth mother, I think her story needs to be told. And I guess my message in the book, I mean, part of it is I tell my personal story and her story, and I really want to make the history of it real to people. I think a lot of people don't know the history, and so when these stories of the past are told, it changes how we understand the present and how we move forward. And I hope that through having a more complex, and sort of visceral understanding of the history of adoption in the United States, people will change the way they think about it, and I hope it can be a catalyst for change for adoption practices. And my big kind of takeaway is that it is adoption is sort of the fulcrum point, that crucial piece within how our nation differentially values women and mothers. And um, women, like I said, women who are disenfranchised through racism and classism and don't have access to resources tend to be the ones whose babies are taken, who are vulnerable. And we are at this tipping point in our nation with the Dobbs decision and the loss of women's access to make their own decisions about their bodies and about how they mother and when they mother. And so I feel like this is a really sort of crazy, vulnerable time in our nation, and we need to reassess how we see motherhood, and how we value mothers in our country right now.
So to piggyback off that a little bit and pick your brain a little, who do you think is ultimately responsible for these poor decision policies that are causing the, like you mentioned, the unfortunately with the lower class income families or the not privileged, families, unfortunately they're the ones that are experiencing this loss of children and the birth mothers getting their children taken away and taken advantage of by the system. Is the system the healthcare system, or are we blaming the policymakers behind it?
I think it's a confluence of lots of different forces. There's a history of pretty abusive practices in social work, but there's also been a lot of changes in that. And one sort of rabbit hole I go down is looking at the Indian adoption project in the 1970s, where it was sort of really literally like assimilation through adoption, and indigenous babies were being taken out of native homes, and that was US government. It's just crazy. And now, I'm not, I don't want to say this one person did it or this group did it. I think at the end of a lot of kind of destructive actions is just ignorance. And I think there's a lot of people in policy, in government, and in social work who really did want to do right by people. And they honestly thought, oh, this is the right thing. This is the best thing. This is the best thing for the baby. This is the best thing for the birth mother. But they were making a decision in a space of a lot of ignorance. And so, I don't want to get into this space of, oh, they did, these people are bad and these people are good. I think where we need to go to is just let's all learn and understand different perspectives and different stories, historical narratives, so that we can do right by each other,
Absolutely. Yeah, very well said. I think a lot of the issues around adoption and these policies being made are the lack of knowledge of adoption and the lack of personal knowledge of adoption. I believe strongly that more people who are adopted who want to have change in the system should maybe try to advance their education or be involved in government more and make these decisions for adopted children because they were one, so they understand how it works. And I think, one.
Having a seat at the table.
Exactly,
Yeah.
100%. I attended a adoption conference a few years ago down in Washington, D.C., and I was in a room of about 50 to 60 adoption professionals. So there's a combination of lawyers, adoption agency directors, social workers, all who were studying adoption. And it was basically this hour-long piece of where everyone debated what's the best for adopted children, right? And I was sitting in the back just kind of like just listening, and I'm thinking, these are kind of odd, like, so at the end they asked for questions, and I stood up and I said, I'm just curious real quick, could I get a raise of hand of who's adopted here? Because I assume you're talking, from personal experience. And I'm sorry to say there was one person in the room out of 60 plus people that
Yeah.
actually was adopted, not including myself. And I said, this is the problem. We need people who are educated in adoption, who can have that personal connection, because not only are they going to come up with practical solutions because they're adopted, they're going to have that emotional part of adoption where they're going to take it to a whole new level. It's going to be it's a passion almost. They want to defend it. They want to nurture it. It's something they really, really care about. And I think that's, when we care about something, you're going to have a better, result. The end product's going to look a lot nicer when you have a personal connection to it.
Yeah. And
Like this book that you're writing, it's going to
yeah,
be amazing because you have a personal connection to it. So, and it
I think
sounds, yeah.
I think the other identity that needs to be at the table too are birth mothers. They need to be part of those conversations as well, and part of shaping policy and practice too. But 100%, I think one thing that drove me crazy as I, sort of, it started really as like a therapy journey to kind of figure out, who am I? What's this past? I just read everything I could get my hands on about adoption from an academic perspective, right? The history of adoption in America, from, history and policy. And by and large, everything has been written by people who are not adopted. And you can see that in their writing. And the one identity group, again, where some historical narratives that have been written by people who have adopted. And it definitely changes the storyline, and you can hear there's a bit of an agenda there to sort of glorify that identity. And I'm really grateful to the folks at the University of Oklahoma Press who took the book on, because I think they saw that I sort of I sat in the middle of that Venn diagram of somebody who's worked in academia, and I can bring in the historical research, and I'm a bit of an outlier because I'm adopted, and I'm willing to share my perspective from a place of vulnerability, which is not that there's not a lot out there that brings all that together,
Yeah, that's the thing about adoption is every story is so unique and
Mhm.
complex that there's no one like one solution, one answer, one similar background besides you can say, "Oh, you're an adoptee? Me too." And then from there it's, 3 hours later after a conversation, you start to see where you're from, what the circumstance was. I mean,
Mhm.
there's so many layers to adoption. That's the
Yes.
thing. That once you start peeling back one layer, it's like an onion. To get to the core, you have to go through, the obvious signs, the emotional part. If you have children, that's a whole other aspect.
Mhm.
And then, I mean, you could spend your whole life thinking about what it means. And the
Yeah.
reality is, some people, it will be a challenge for them, struggling to how to identify. So the fact that you spent 40 years and then all of a sudden you realized, wow, like there's this part of me that I didn't really think about fully until you
Mhm.
had your own children, and now that inspired you, and then your sister's story, how that inspired you to write a book. You can see that now you're starting to kind of change perspectives, and I think that is really, really cool because it's going to open up a whole different side to you that you're going to get to discover and pass that on to your family and your kids.
Mm.
And I think
Yeah.
it's going to be a really special bond that you'll be able to create with them. To watch their mother go through that process is going to make them feel
Oh,
more connected. I'm just saying that because I'm speaking from
yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm
So
hearing that. Yeah.
well,
Oh,
I believe it's going to be very positive. I mean, like the story with my
oh,
adoptive mother and I going back to my orphanage and seeing it
wow.
from as an adult with her. She
Yeah.
went there and got me all those years ago, and now we're back there as, I'm an adult.
Wow.
We're like best friends back there now, looking at it, and it's a bond that's something that's why I interviewed her and got her on here because I'm like
Yeah.
I want a recording of this for my kids. So
That's
it's
cool.
but yeah, it's just incredible. So. About the book, how long is it? How long's the book? Is it chapters? Is it a picture book? Give me some information
No,
about this.
it's a history. It is published at the University of Oklahoma Press, so it's not a picture book. There are no pictures. But I hope.
I'm not reading it. No, I'm just kidding. I want a signed copy though. I want a
Oh
signed
yeah,
copy.
100%. I hope that it's accessible for everybody. I don't want it to be a sort of dry, I don't want it to be a history textbook. Like I said, a lot of what's out there about the history of adoption, it's pretty dry stuff. I mean, it's incredible stories, but written from a very sort of sterile, you know, historical research perspective. And so I really wanted to make it accessible and share personal voice and I think it will be, I hope a lot of people will enjoy reading it. And it's about 200 pages. So not, it's not like, a dictionary. Um, can read it in a couple days, I think, hopefully.
Yep. Yep.
Uh, and it's just now starting. I just signed the contract a couple weeks ago, and so it's now in the pipeline and will be out in the spring of 2024. So I think, it will be, you can pre-order it starting, I think, January, February of 2024. But it's in the pipeline and I will be on a book tour next spring. It'll be accessible through Amazon, Barnes and Noble online, and then hopefully at every independent bookstore across the United States. And I hope to, just be out there next spring, meeting people and talking about it and sharing it. So,
That's awesome. With the book tour, is it going to be focused on the entire country, or you're going to go to the
I'm,
East Coast, the West
oh
Coast,
yeah,
stay on the West
well,
Coast? Yeah.
yeah, I'm kind of going to where I've got friends and family right now. And so I'm going to go down the West Coast, of course, all over Seattle, down through Oregon and California. I've got family and friends in California, and then I've got some friends in the Southwest, so I want to do a little Southwest tour, and then of course the East Coast. All my in-laws are up and down the East Coast, so I want to hit Boston. I used to live in Boston, and
Oh, really? I'm only 45 minutes away from Boston,
oh, okay,
so
yeah. Well,
yep,
I went to Simmons University
yep.
for graduate. I did a graduate program there, and so I would love to go speak at Simmons, and got family in the Boston area, and so definitely want to do Boston, New York, and just have fun,
Yeah,
see
that's
friends
awesome.
and tour around and talk about the book. That's my goal.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, you have to let me know when you're out in Boston, and
Oh yeah,
so I can get my autograph.
yeah, for sure.
That's awesome. I mean, it's inspiring that you're writing this story. You'd be surprised. There's a lot of adoptees who are writing their own books,
I
or have
know.
already published. I'm working on one as well. So
Oh,
it's
that's so
it's
awesome.
in the point I was going to make, because we were just talking about how, you look at the history of adoption, and you made the comment how it's all dry, it's old, it's sounds like someone who wasn't, like you said, adopted wrote it. And I think
Yeah.
the really cool thing is, with the age of the internet and with all the resources we have now, and the fact that we're now starting to kind of show the world and talk about adoption and who are adoptees, we have the ability to write the new chapters, right?
Hmm.
Our books are the next generation, so we can educate people about what adoption is from an adoptee. And I think that's
Yeah.
what really, really matters. We,
Yeah.
it's an, I think Ronald Reagan made a quote or something like that. I don't know why I just thought of this, but he made the quote that, we have the power to begin the world over again.
Hmm.
And I believe with adoption, adoptees have the power to change the view and the narrative. That's why we're
Yeah.
out here speaking about it. That's why we're writing books. That's why you know, we're employed by half of the United States universities like yourself, and we're educating people about this. So
Yeah.
that's
It's
just
all about
amazing.
telling your story, just like you said. Got to tell
Exactly. So
stories. Yeah.
so this book's going to be very accessible to buy online.
Absolutely.
We
Yep.
have your website, RebeccaWellington.com. We'll list that on our website as well for a link, so people can check it out. We'll
Awesome.
we'll get you on social media, no problem. We'll make sure
No,
people know about your
I am
book
now
and
on there. I have a link tree on my contact site on the website, so you can connect to me. I'll, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and I'm posting regularly. And as we get closer to publication and pre-ordering, there's going to be a lot on there. And yeah, that's the best way to sort of stay in touch
yeah.
and yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'd like to give you one last opportunity to leave us with a couple words of wisdom or a message that you'd like to pass on.
Well, I'm just really inspired by people like you who are I'm again sort of new to this community of adoptees, which is crazy because I'm adopted, and I'm it's so inspired by folks in your generation who are just bravely you've been telling your story and uncovering your truth, and I'm just really grateful that you're out here doing this and that other people are doing it. And so I guess my message is to just keep being brave and keep telling your story.
Oh, that's great. And that's wonderful. And I have to give a lot of credit to the age of the internet for
Yes.
inspiring us to
Yeah,
be
connect
able
the world.
to, because I'm sure a lot of adoptees who are 30 and younger will say, well, when I wanted to find out information, I sat there and Googled and said, how do I find my birth parents? And I'm sure they were all curious at one point, but
Yeah,
it's incredible, and we're out there sharing our stories. It's so important, and yours is tremendous. And it's amazing what you're doing, and you're giving back to your generation that should, and every other generation should be educated on adoption, the history of adoption,
yeah,
the good side, and also the bad side. It's important they get the full image, and
yeah.
you're able to provide that. Your book's going to be able to provide that. Again, it's going to be coming next spring, 2020, 2024. We can find it at RebeccaWellington.com. We'll get some links for you as well. But again, thank you so much for telling your story. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and to hear about the amazing journey that you could just say you're just starting to embark on.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we'll
yeah.
have to get you back on to give us an update when your book gets released. We can
Oh,
you have
100%.
you have to
Love
tell
that.
us all about it, and we can tell you can tell us what your favorite parts are. We can go more in depth
Yeah,
anytime you'd like, but
great.
we're excited for you. Thank you so much for stopping by. It really means a lot
Yeah, well,
here
thank you
with
for that. I've
us.
really
Thank you again. That was Dr. Rebecca Wellington from Seattle, Washington. We'll keep in touch with her and provide updates to come. As a last note to all the listeners, thank you so much again for tuning in with another episode here at Voice of Adoptees. Our podcast will be available every Wednesday. You'll be able to find the links to Rebecca's upcoming book, and we will see you next time here at Voice of Adoptees. Who am I?
Thanks for listening to Voice of Adoptees. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a review. See you next time.